two massive armies, enough weapons to erase each other entirely. And yet, both of them just sat there, staring at each other for decades. Not because they were kind, not because they were afraid, but because of a reason stranger than anything else in military history. And that story begins on a quiet morning in the New Mexico desert, when a small group of scientists believed they had just changed the world forever. They were right, but not in the way they thought. Early morning, July 16, 1945, at the Trinity site in New Mexico, a massive 6.2-ton device was detonated for the very first time in human history, a flash brighter than the midday sun, a shockwave that knocked men off their feet over 10 miles away, a mushroom cloud rising 40,000 feet into the sky in mere minutes. Oppenheimer, the head of the project, stood watching, recalling a chilling line from ancient Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But the most remarkable thing wasn't the explosion. When engineers returned to measure the site, they found the sand at the epicenter had fused into a pale green glass, later named trinitite. The soil was saturated with radiation. Nothing could live there for a very long time. And that is when a few people in the group began to realize they had just created something that wasn't exactly a weapon. Every weapon in history served a very specific purpose: to help you take what you want. You capture a city to control its ports. You conquer territory to extract its resources. Fight, win, take. That was the absolute logic running through every single war from the beginning of time. This new weapon shattered that logic entirely. If you use it on a city, that city vanishes, not captured, erased it. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. 70 to 140,000 people killed in Skenset. But what was lost wasn't just human life. It was the entire infrastructure, the supply systems, everything that gave the city value. You finish your attack, and the very prize you wanted to take is no longer there. For the first time in history, the most powerful weapon was simultaneously the most useless weapon, if your goal was to actually gain something after the war. But for a brief period, only the United States had it. And that was enough to shift the global balance of power, without firing a single conventional shot. The Soviet Union understood this perfectly, and they did the only thing they could do: build the exact same thing, at any cost. The Soviet nuclear program in the late 1940s mobilized over 700,000 people. Entire secret cities were built from scratch, absent from any map, missing from any phone book. The city of Sarov vanished from all official documents for over 40 years. And what about the Americans? The Hanford complex in Washington state spanned over 1,500 square kilometers, larger than the entire nation of Singapore, running continuously just to produce plutonium. At its peak, over 51,000 people worked there, most of them having no idea what they were actually making. Oak Ridge in Tennessee. The uranium enrichment site consumed more electricity than the entire city of Chicago. All of that staggering effort to create something that no one actually intended to use. In 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their bomb. The balance instantly shifted. At the peak of the Cold War, the US had over 31,000 warheads, the Soviets over 40,000, enough to wipe out every major city on Earth, multiple times over. But to truly understand why neither side ever pushed the button, you need to know about the terrifying moments when it almost happened. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, a Soviet diesel submarine, the B-59, was trapped in a terrifying situation where no one on board understood what was happening above. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The batteries were nearly dead, and for days, absolute silence from Moscow. Outside, the US Navy was dropping signaling depth charges, small, non-lethal explosives, meant only to signal the sub to surface. The Americans had announced this via diplomatic channels, but Captain Savitsky had no idea. He just heard the explosions, no information, no way to verify. And the most logical conclusion in his exhausted mind was the war had already begun. He ordered the preparation of a nuclear torpedo, packing a 15-kiloton yield, equal to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. To launch, he needed the unanimous agreement of all 3 senior officers on board. Two of them nodded yes. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, who just happened to be on that specific submarine, shook his head no, not because he was perfectly calm, but because he realized one crucial detail. If war had truly broken out, the Americans wouldn't be using tiny charges to deal with a diesel sub. They had much bigger weapons for that. He convinced Savitsky to surface. And shortly after, Moscow confirmed there was no war. Thomas Blanton, director of the U.S. National Security Archive, later stated it bluntly. Arkhipov literally saved the world. No exaggeration. 21 years later, the night of September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov was working the night shift in a bunker near Moscow. And the screen in front of him suddenly displayed the one thing no one ever wanted to see. The early warning system detected incoming American nuclear missiles. One, then another, and another 5 signals in total, and the system reliability read, "Heck hest puzzable." The protocol was crystal clear. Report it immediately to trigger a massive retaliation before the missiles could even land. Petrov did not report it. His reasoning was almost absurdly simple. If the US really wanted to attack, they wouldn't launch just 5 missiles. They would launch hundreds, enough to completely cripple any retaliation. 5 missiles made zero strategic sense, plus ground-based radar showed absolutely nothing. He concluded it was a system malfunction, and he was right. The satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. He was later officially reprimanded for failing to properly log the incident in his diary that night. Those 2 events, the B-59 and Petrov, weren't just freak accidents. They were the inevitable byproduct of a system built on a massive paradox. That system had a name: MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. Simply put, if you shoot at me, I shoot back, and neither of us is left standing. The logic goes like this. If one side launches, the other side does wait to see where the missiles land. Early warning systems detect the launch in minutes. Retaliation is triggered, and missiles cross paths high in the atmosphere. Before the first strike even hits, the counterstrike is already in the air, meaning it is mathematically impossible for only one side to suffer. Military planners ran thousands of simulations, altering timing, scale, speed, desperately trying to find a way to strike first without facing total retaliation. The result was always the same, because something always survived. Submarines patrolling completely undetected in deep oceans, like the B-59. Missiles buried deep under solid rock, bombers loitering in international airspace, assets specifically designed to survive the first wave and strike back. Even if your surprise attack destroyed 90% of their arsenal, that surviving 10% was enough to end civilization. Eventually, this stopped being a tactical puzzle. It became a permanent conclusion. There is no path to military victory. And when both sides fully understood that reality, direct warfare simply stopped. But the building of weapons didn't stop. Because this system didn't run on the actual use of weapons, it ran on the absolute belief that they would be used if necessary. If that belief falters, the balance shatters. And that fragile balance, for decades, wasn't maintained by presidents or peace treaties. It was held together by men like Arkhipov and Petrov, sitting in cramped, sweating rooms, deciding not to act immediately. And that is the strangest part of this entire story. The atomic bomb wasn't the ultimate weapon to win a war. It was the first weapon to make victory obsolete. And ironically, that is exactly why it was the only thing keeping the next world war from starting. Not because humans suddenly became wiser, but because for the very first time in history, the absolute cost of beginning the fight was infinitely higher than anything you could possibly win at the end.